welcome. Every year, thousands of people walk through the doors of Bendigo's Ulumbarra Theatre. They come to enjoy the music and drama and comedy. And today on my visit, the theatre is filled with families attending a Bluey concert. The contrast with the building's former purpose could hardly be greater. I wonder how many stop to consider what this building once was. Long before it became one of Australia's most unique performing arts venues, these brick and bluestone walls served a very different purpose. For almost 150 years, this was Sandhurst Gaol. Thousands of men, women and children passed through these gates. Some were convicted of little more than drunkenness or petty theft, lots for vagrancy. Others were fraudsters, bushrangers and murderers. And among them were men and women who had already travelled halfway around the world as transported convicts. The story of Sandhurst Gaol is often told as the history of a prison, but it is far more than that. It is the story of a colony transformed by gold, a justice system struggling to keep pace with explosive growth, a society determined to maintain order in the midst of extraordinary change. It is also the story of ordinary people. Some made a single disastrous decision that altered the course of their lives, and others were habitual offenders who repeatedly found themselves before the courts. Some became infamous, and others disappeared into history, remembered only through fading court records, prison registers and newspaper reports. Among them was a man named William Nicholls. At just 17 years of age, he stood before a court in Norwich, England, convicted of stealing a horse. Sentenced to 10 years transportation, he sailed to Australia aboard the Marion in 1847 as one of Britain's 1,727 Pentonville Exiles. So who were Britain's Pentonville Exiles? Well, the Pentonville Exiles were part of a short-lived British experiment in convict rehabilitation during the 1840s. By this time, the British government was facing growing criticism of its transportation system. Simply sending convicts to Australia was no longer seen as an effective solution to crime. Prison reformers questioned whether transportation actually reformed offenders, while many Australian colonists increasingly opposed receiving more convicts. I wonder why. In response, Britain introduced a new system. Instead of transporting prisoners immediately after conviction, selected offenders were first imprisoned in Britain, most commonly at the Pentonville prison in London, although many also passed through Millbank Prison and Parkhurst Prison. Pentonville Prison opened in 1842 and was considered one of the most modern prisons in Europe. It operated under what was known as the separate system. Prisoners spent almost the entire day alone in their individual cells. They worked alone, they exercised alone, and when attending chapel, specially designed partitions prevented them from seeing one another, as you can see in this image here. And if you've ever been to Port Arthur, the chapel there also is designed this way. The purpose was psychological as much as physical. Even when moving through the prison, prisoners wore masks to conceal their identities. Oh, dear me. Reformers believed that solitude, religious instruction, education and discipline routine would encourage prisoners to reflect upon their crimes and emerge as reformed individuals. I wonder how that turned out. After serving a period of imprisonment, carefully selected prisoners received conditional pardons, and rather than remaining in Britain, they were transported to Australia as exiles. Unlike earlier transported convicts, They were not assigned to government labour gangs or private masters. Instead, they arrived as free labourers, expected to support themselves through employment. Although still legally under sentence, they possessed far greater freedom than convicts transported during earlier decades. Between 1844 and 1849, approximately 3,500 exiles were sent to Australia under this scheme. And you may have heard me mention the 1,700 number before, but that was the number that was sent to Tasmania. The rest, the majority, were actually sent to Victoria, including William. Many arrived aboard ships such as the Marion, the Hashemi, the Randolph, the Sir George Seymour, and the Mount Stuart Elphinstone, and their arrival proved controversial. Many colonists argued that exiles were simply convicts under another name. Large public meetings were held in Melbourne protesting against their arrival, while newspapers debated whether Britain was attempting to disguise continued transportation. Despite these objections, the exiles entered colonial society. Most found employment as labourers, shepherds, carpenters, blacksmiths, shoemakers, and farm workers, and many married, raised families, and became respected members of their communities. Some disappeared entirely into colonial life, others returned to crime. William Nicholls was 17 years old when he was convicted of horse theft, and he was sentenced to 10 years transportation. Following a period at Millbank Prison, he was selected for the Pentonville Exile scheme because British authorities believed he possessed the qualities necessary for rehabilitation. He could read and write, and he had a recognised trade as a shoemaker, and he was young. In many respects, William represented exactly the type of prisoner the scheme hoped to reform. His later imprisonment at Sandhurst Gaol, nearly 30 years later, makes his life a valuable case study in assessing whether Britain's experiment ultimately achieved its aims. The Pentonville Exile scheme itself was short-lived. Growing opposition from Australian colonists, together with continuing debates over transportation in Britain, led to its abandonment by the early 1850s. Nevertheless, the exiles left a lasting legacy. They settled permanently in Australia, contributing to the development of towns, farms, and industries across the colonies. Their stories also challenge one of Australia's most enduring historical myths that I believe I've been smashing in my videos. Although Victoria proudly described itself as a free colony, many of the men who helped build it had begun their Australian lives as transported convicts under Britain's final experiments in penal reform. William Nicholls' ship reached Hobart in January 1848 before continuing on to Port Phillip, arriving in Williamstown on the 25th of January 1848, and records state that William went on shore at his own request, which he was able to do because he was a part of the Pentonville program. For the next several years, William appeared to do exactly what Britain had hoped. He travelled into central Victoria and he found employment on the property of George McCall near Daisy Hill, close to Kyneton. While working there, he met George's daughter, Margaret McCall, and they married on the 10th of January 1855 at St Paul's Church in Kyneton. This was exactly the outcome British reformers wanted. A former convict had found work, married, settled and started his own family. And over the following years, William worked as a shoemaker, a labourer, farmer, bootmaker and horse trainer. And the family lived around Daisy Hill, like I said, near Kyneton in country Victoria. For a time, William appeared to have escaped his past. Unfortunately, that success did not last. Beginning during the 1860s and continuing into the 1870s, William's name began appearing repeatedly before Victorian magistrates. Court reports record convictions involving drunkenness, threatening behaviour, reckless conduct, neglect, larceny, fraud, obtaining goods by false pretences, and animal cruelty. And unlike many former exiles, William seems unable or unwilling to leave crime behind. The offences became increasingly frequent. In January 1877, William committed the offence that finally brought him to Sandhurst Gaol. While in Bridgewater, he passed worthless cheques on consecutive days. Now, Bridgewater is a small town just outside of Bendigo. This was effectively obtaining goods or money through deception. The fraud was quickly discovered. William appeared before the police court at Inglewood, and the magistrate sentenced him to 6 months imprisonment with hard labour. A second sentence of 2 months was imposed concurrently. His destination? Sandhurst Gaol. One of these prison cells, maybe even this one, I don't know. Can you imagine? No heating, no cooling, not much light. It really would have been a very grim place indeed. So almost 30 years had passed since he had stepped ashore from the Marion, and he was no longer a 17-year-old exile full of promise. He was now a middle-aged repeat offender. Unfortunately, prison records tell us relatively little about William's daily life while imprisoned. Like most prisoners, he would have surrendered his clothing, been medically examined, issued prison clothing, assigned a cell, placed under the strict daily routine of the Sandhurst Gaol. His sentence included hard labour. And although surviving records do not specify his exact duties, prisoners at Sandhurst during this period commonly undertook work such as stone breaking, wood cutting, prison maintenance, cleaning, and labour within the prison grounds. Unlike transportation, imprisonment at Sandhurst was intended to punish while enforcing strict discipline through routine and work. Now, apologies for the glare, but I did want to include some of those information panels in the video because I just thought it was really interesting, and not everyone gets to come to Bendigo. And I just want to say, haven't they done a magnificent job of converting this former prison into a theatre? It really is quite stunning. So back to William. William was released after serving his sentence, and he only lived another 5 years. And he died in March of 1882 at only 51 years of age. Another fascinating story of an ex-convict who spent time within these walls was a man named William Douglas, but history remembers him by another name, Black Douglas. Transported from England after a conviction for theft, he became one of the most feared names on the Victorian goldfields. Newspaper reports transformed him into the notorious bushranger, said to haunt the lonely roads between Melbourne and Bendigo. Modern historians now question how much of that reputation was deserved and how much was created by sensational reporting. Not only was Black Douglas held within Sandhurst Gaol, but his life ended here. I'm told that few individuals associated with the Victorian goldfields have attracted more legend than the man known as Black Douglas. But as someone who has grown up within and around the Victorian goldfields, can I say I have never heard of this man until I started research on the Bendigo jail. Have you heard of him? If so, let me know in the comments. So for more than a century, he has appeared in local histories, newspaper articles and popular accounts as one of the most feared bushrangers in colonial Victoria. And I'm not sure what that says about our curriculum, but I have never heard of him. Stories described him haunting the roads through the Black Forest, robbing travellers between Melbourne, Kyneton and Castlemaine and Bendigo, and becoming one of the most notorious criminals of the Gold Rush. But modern historical research suggests that the truth is considerably more complex. One of the most significant studies of William Douglas is Heather Knight's 2022 paper, Black Douglas, The Man and the Myth, published by the Bendigo Historical Society. And by comparing contemporary newspaper reports with court records, convict registers and prison documents, Heather demonstrates that the legend surrounding Black Douglas often exceeded the documentary evidence. Well, that doesn't surprise me. They did the same thing to the female convicts. Just add that in. The man behind the legend was William Douglas. Now, he was probably born, they believe, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, around 1817. And although aspects of his early life remain uncertain, historians generally accept that he was African American, making him one of the very few black convicts transported to Australia whose life can be reconstructed from surviving records. Historian Dr. Meg Foster, whose research examines race, crime and punishment in colonial Australia, argues that Douglas's race cannot be separated from the way he was represented by the colonial press. In a society where people of African descent were extremely uncommon, Douglas's appearance attracted considerable attention. Newspaper descriptions frequently emphasised his physical characteristics as much as his alleged crimes, contributing to a public image that portrayed him as an unusually dangerous and exotic figure. Somehow, Douglas found himself working as a house servant in England in 1835. At just 18 years of age, he appeared before the Sussex Assizes, charged with stealing 2 coats. And I'm sure there is an amazing story behind all of this, and I am going to do a video on William Douglas because his story is fascinating. There's so much going on and I really want to delve deeper into it. So he was convicted and sentenced to 7 years transportation to New South Wales. And his punishment did not end there. Just look at that convict conduct record. There is a lot going on there. So he looks like he was a real, he was a character. So while still under sentence in Sydney, Douglas was convicted of another serious offence, highway robbery. And he received an additional term of 10 years transportation to Van Diemen's Land, where he spent time at Port Arthur. By the time he obtained his freedom, he had spent many years within Britain's convict system before joining the thousands of former convicts who migrated to Victoria during the Gold Rush. Like many others, William Douglas came seeking opportunity. Unlike most, though, he became a legend. Court records confirm that William Douglas was repeatedly convicted of offences including assault, drunkenness, vagrancy, horse theft, and passing counterfeit coins. He lived much of his life on the margins of colonial society and was well known to police throughout central Victoria. Whether he deserved the reputation of being one of Victoria's most feared bushrangers is another question. Heather Knight concludes that while Douglas was undoubtedly a habitual offender, much of his later notoriety resulted from sensational newspaper reporting rather than documented criminal activity. As robberies occurred throughout the Black Forest, journalists frequently associated his name with crimes for which surviving evidence is incomplete or entirely absent. Dr. Meg Foster's research adds another dimension to this interpretation. She argues that Douglas's race almost certainly amplified public fascination with his crimes. In 19th century Victoria, an African American former convict was an unusual figure, although I have heard of numerous ones on the goldfields who did find significant amounts of gold. Anyway, and the colonial press often represented him as a curiosity as well as a criminal. Over time, those repeated descriptions helped transform William Douglas from a repeat offender into a legendary bushranger. By the 1890s, however, the legend had outlived the man. Aging, impoverished, and in declining health, Douglas was convicted of vagrancy and sent to Sandhurst Gaol. There was no dramatic final gunfight, no famous capture, and no public execution. Instead, he died quietly within the prison in 1892 while serving a short sentence. By the closing decades of the 19th century, Sandhurst Gaol served several functions within Victoria's criminal justice system. It housed prisoners awaiting trial, it accommodated those serving sentences imposed by courts throughout central Victoria, and it also became a place where the most serious sentence available under colonial law was carried out: death. Capital punishment formed an established part of the British legal system inherited by the Australian colonies. During the 19th century, murder remained a capital offence, and executions continued throughout Victoria long after transportation had ended. Unlike the public hangings of earlier centuries, executions in Victoria were increasingly conducted within prison walls. Legislation reflected changing public attitudes. Government sought to administer justice while removing executions from public spectacle. Only officials, selected witnesses, and in some cases members of the press were permitted to attend. Sandhurst Gaol became one of the prisons authorised to carry out those sentences. Although relatively few executions occurred there, each represented the final stage of a lengthy legal process involving police investigations, criminal trials, appeals, and ultimately executive approval. The last execution carried out at Sandhurst Gaol took place on the 15th of September 1897. The prisoner was Charles John Hall. Hall had been convicted of the murder of his wife Minnie Hall at Durham Ox near Pyramid Hill, and if you've ever been out that way, it is quite remote. The case attracted considerable attention throughout Victoria. Evidence presented during the trial established that Minnie Hall had died as a result of severe violence, and I believe there are some images of her body online, and yeah, it was not nice. Following his conviction, Charles Hall was sentenced to death. On the morning of the 15th of September 1897, Charles Hall was executed by hanging within the prison grounds. A prison medical officer certified death. The sentence imposed by the Supreme Court had been carried out. Hall's body was buried within the jail precinct, as was customary for executed prisoners. Victoria eventually abolished capital punishment for murder in 1975. By the time the prison finally closed in 2006, the philosophy of corrections had shifted towards rehabilitation, education, and preparation for release. The buildings remained largely unchanged. The ideas that shaped them had altered profoundly. Eventually, however, another question emerged. What should become of a 19th century prison that no longer met the needs of a modern correctional system? The answer would transform Sandhurst Gaol more completely than anyone involved in its construction could ever have imagined. For almost 150 years, Sandhurst Gaol remained an active part of Victoria's correctional system. For many local residents, Sandhurst Gaol was not simply an historic building, it was part of everyday life. I remember walking to school during the 1990s. My school stood beside the prison, and it was common to see inmates working in the prison gardens at the time. It seemed almost ordinary. Like many locals, I gave little thought to the history contained within those walls. They were simply a part of the landscape of Bendigo. Only later did I come to appreciate that the men tending those gardens were occupying the same prison that had once held former transported convicts, bushrangers, fraudsters and prisoners, women and children also, sentenced by colonial courts more than a century earlier. That continuity is one of Sandhurst Gaol's most remarkable characteristics. By the late 20th century, however, it had become increasingly clear that the prison no longer met the requirements of a modern correctional system. Changing expectations surrounding prisoner welfare, security, rehabilitation and accommodation made it difficult to adapt a 19th century prison to contemporary standards. Like many historic public buildings, Sandhurst Gaol had reached a point where preserving the past conflicted with the practical demands of the present. In 2006, after almost 150 years of continuous operation, Bendigo Prison officially closed. Rather than removing the prison from Bendigo's landscape, a decision was made to preserve much of the historic complex and adapt it for an entirely new purpose. The result was the Ulumbarra Theatre. Now the name Ulumbarra, meaning gathered together in the language of the Dja Dja Wurrung people, reflects a profound transformation in the building's purpose. Where the prison had once isolated individuals from society, the theatre was designed to bring the community together. Sandhurst Gaol tells many stories. It tells the story of the gold rush that transformed Bendigo. It tells the story of a justice system adapting to a rapidly growing colony. And it tells the story of transported convicts such as William Nicholls, whose life illustrates both the opportunities and limitations of Britain's final experiments in convict reform. And it tells the story of William Douglas, known as Black Douglas, whose life reminds us that historical evidence is often more complex than popular legend. And I wonder if William Douglas, Black Douglas, is buried within the prison precinct. That's something that I'm going to explore in a future video. It tells the story of thousands of ordinary prisoners whose names survive only in court records, prison registers, and fading newspaper reports. These are not simply stories about crime, they are stories about colonial society, about migration, poverty, opportunity, and justice. and about the people who shaped the history of Bendigo, whether intentionally or otherwise. Today, audiences applaud performances where prison officers once counted inmates. Actors take to a stage built within walls designed for confinement. Visitors wander around corridors once walked by prisoners serving sentences handed down more than a century ago. It is truly a remarkable transformation.